All right, folks, we'll go ahead and get started as people continue to trickle in. Welcome to this evening's Wild Wednesday webcast. I'm Chandra LeGue. I'm Oregon Wild's Senior Conservation Advocate in our Eugene office, and I'll be guiding you through this webcast tonight and talking an awful lot. But I also have with me Francis Oyung with Rogue Riverkeeper and John Persell, staff attorney at Oregon Wild, who will be helping with talking about this exciting topic of a new management plan proposal for Western Oregon's BLM forests. So if anyone here is new to these webcasts or to Oregon Wild, I'll just give you a brief orientation before we get started. So first, if you're not familiar with Oregon Wild, we work statewide to protect and restore the wildlands, wildlife, and waters in our state. A year or so ago, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. So we've been advocating for public lands, wildlife in their habitat, wild and scenic rivers, and old growth forests that grow across the state since 1974. Today we have staff in Portland, Eugene, Bend, and Enterprise, and we're advancing protections for wild places and rivers, defending environmental laws and policies that keep our forests standing tall, and ensuring that native wildlife have what they need to thrive. We're also working to build community support for our work, and I think tonight is a great example of a topic that a lot of people are really concerned about and have been calling and emailing us about. And so we're happy to have you here to learn more about it and so we can help you take action. So before we get started, again, with this webcast, if you bought a raffle ticket where you signed up, we will be doing that drawing tomorrow. And if you want a raffle ticket for some Oregon Wild merch, you can go back to where you registered for this webcast on Oregon Wild's website, and you can still buy those. We are recording this webcast, and we will email out a copy or a recording tomorrow, and it'll be on our website under resources and on our YouTube channel. We have a couple of great webcasts coming up over the next month or so. One about grizzly bears and one about the ecology of burned forests. So look for those on our website as well. And then as we go along, if you have questions that come up while we're talking about this, you can enter those with using the little Q&A icon in the Zoom interface, and we will save some time at the end for answering questions. So if you enter questions as they come up for you, that's more helpful than waiting to the end when we often get a slew of them. So we'll be able to process those if you put them in the Q&A beforehand. So thanks for that. All right. So yeah, Francis and John, if you want to take a back seat for a moment, we'll come back to you in a couple minutes. All right. Well, I'm going to start with a little context of these BLM lands. If you are familiar with Oregon Wild at all, you know that we often put up this map of Oregon public lands because that's a lot of where we work. And the colors on this map correspond to our national forests, national parks, which in this case is just Crater Lake, our state lands, our wildlife refuges, and covering a lot of the state in the sort of peachy color are our BLM lands. So that's the Bureau of Land Management, which manage about 16 million acres across the state of Oregon. Now, most of those are east of the Cascades and include a lot of high desert areas, but you will see that there is a lot also on the west side of the Cascades that sort of line the Willamette Valley and down into the Siskiyou Mountains. And that is where we'll be focusing our efforts talking about tonight. So real briefly, why are we here talking about this tonight? You probably know that's why you're here. But there is a management plan that currently covers, or a couple of management plans that currently cover these Western Oregon BLM lands and the various districts of the BLM from Salem down to Medford. And and some of you may have been here to comment on what we called Whopper and Whopper Jr., the Western Oregon Plan Revision, which started back in 2005 and went through a couple of iterations and eventually the management plan was put in place in 2016. John will be covering some more of that later. But the new proposal that was announced last month would be to revise these resource management plans again. And we're currently in the 30-day comment period, which ends on March 23rd. This management plan revision is pretty different than the last time around in that its sole purpose is to increase harvest levels on these lands. So it's pretty concerning because of that. As we'll talk about, there are a lot of other values to consider for these BLM lands. And so we're here to talk about what those are. So this proposal for revising the plan would cover all of Western Oregon's BLM lands. It's about 2.5 million acres. Except consider that the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, a couple of wilderness areas, and wild and scenic rivers found on BLM lands have their own management plans and would be sort of a little separate from this revision. What we're not talking about tonight, I just want to make it clear since we've been talking about a lot of other new plans for public lands, is we're not talking about our national forests. Or the Northwest Forest Plan. And we're not talking about areas covered by the roadless rule, the roadless area conservation rule, which also is there's proposal to take that away from protecting many national forest lands, but it does not apply to BLM. So just wanted to make that clear, or hopefully clear. Okay. Well, why are BLM lands in this funky layout? Alongside the Coast Range and Cascades, along the valleys, and in this checkerboard pattern, quite frankly, in many of the areas. Well, it goes back a long ways. Back in the mid-1800s, the government wanted to help settle the West, and railroad companies wanted to, get in here and build railroads, essentially north and south on I-5. And the government essentially gave the ONC Railroad, that stands for Oregon and California, see, I-5, gave them a bunch of land in these mile blocks within a certain distance of where they were planning to put the railroad. And the idea was that they would sell them to settlers in order to facilitate the taming of the West. They didn't follow the rules that were applied to that deal. And so in the early 1900s, a bunch of these lands anyway, were revested back from the railroad and brought into the federal government's holdings again. Later, the General Lands Office, which took them, became the Bureau of Land Management. So that's how the BLM got into the forest management business on the west side of the Cascades. Later on, in the 1930s, the ONC Act was passed, which gave some direction to the BLM on how to manage these forests. And John's going to talk more about the ONC Act. Really important note, lest we forget that these lands were not empty. They were not really to be given away. They were stolen. Native peoples within dozens of tribal nations inhabited Western Oregon before the settlement and development by the railroad and our cities that are here today. And so all of this government ownership and management was really only made possible by the forced removal of these people. And let's remember that many of these people still live amongst these lands and use them. As soon as the BLM started managing these lands, the priority really has been on logging them. I mean, these are highly productive, low elevation, pretty accessible from the Willamette Valley lands. And so from the 1940s into the 1980s, they were pretty quickly clear cut, a large portion of them. Environmental laws, of course, were passed in the 1970s, but those didn't do a lot to slow the clear cutting. And so we've been left with, simplified tree farms, a lack of old growth forests, and a lot of roads and damage to our waterways from this really intensive logging in this period. In the 1980s, especially things have really ramped up. We were seeing, well, this stat says 200,000 log truckloads of old growth being hauled off of these BLM lands each year. And so by the late 1980s, when endangered species began to be listed because we were cutting down all their old growth habitat, we were left with on BLM lands, less than 500,000 acres of real old growth. If you count forests that are mature in old growth, we have about 1 million acres left on these BLM lands. Again, really important habitat close to the Willamette Valley. I have this little map up here which shows past logging on BLM lands, and just a little snapshot around the town of Alsea in the Coast Range. So you can see that even while the BLM lands are very fragmented in their checkerboard nature, because of how they were set up, and remember that a lot of the white squares are privately owned timberland, and so those are also clear cut. All of those little green polygons on the squares are past logging, is past logging on BLM lands. And so fragments upon fragments of the forest, and now largely tree plantations. Well, all of that management and logging led to the Northwest Forest Plan in the early 1990s. As I said, as species that depend on these forests were being driven to extinction, like the northern spotted owl and the marbled murrelet and Pacific salmon. And when the Northwest Forest Plan was put in place, in an effort to balance wildlife habitat needs and logging, the BLM was considered an essential part of this ecosystem management framework. They are, as you know, they're a connecting piece between the national forests across the valleys from north to south and across mountain ranges in the Siskiyous as well. So in essence, these forests really matter. Ecologically, they really matter. Because they're providing those corridors and connected to national forests. And I think, they're talked about as being very productive. And I think a lot of times that's thought of in terms of like timber production, but they're productive in so many other ways. They're storing carbon, they're filtering water, they're providing habitat. And quite honestly, because of the way that they're situated on the landscape, they're often right in our backyards, and I think that makes them more important too. So I'll go pretty quickly through some of these ways that these lands are important. And hang on a sec. Good clean water from the Mackenzie River. Water that comes from these BLM lands is vital for not just Pacific salmon, but also lamprey and trout species. And for many people, they get their drinking water from these lands. So in Eugene, my water comes from the Mackenzie River, and part of the Mackenzie River flows through BLM lands. But maybe more people scattered amongst these parcels of BLM lands in the Coast Range and the Cascade foothills rely on water, right in their backyards, literally, from springs and small streams. And so what happens on BLM lands really affects, the water that they drink just on a daily basis outside of bigger cities. I've mentioned wildlife, and especially endangered wildlife, but there are many, sorry, there's a cop car going by, so I got distracted. But there's many native species that rely on these BLM lands. There are the critters that the spotted owls eat, like red tree voles. There are all sorts of bird species. other endangered species like the coastal martin might make their home on some BLM lands, or at least once did. Our state animal, beavers, love the lower elevation streams that we have on BLM land. So in essence, they're really vital. And again, I've already talked about the connections between habitats. Um, these are some of our best places to go recreate, to hunt, to fish, to forage. Um, these are all pictures taken on BLM lands, and there's just so many important cultural uses that, from Native peoples who are still finding foods on these lands to, taking a 4-day raft trip down the wild and scenic road. So there's many reasons, and I'll talk in a minute about some other recreation areas that I know and love. And then, a lot of the values that I'm expressing about these BLM lands really tie to the mature and old growth forests that are left on these lands. Even if they're in small patches, they're really vital for all of these things I'm talking about. This image on the left, just realized it looks a little like a lung. Um, Not coincidental, maybe, is an image showing tree height. So if anyone's familiar with LiDAR imaging, it shows the sort of the height of things off the ground, and the darker the colors in this case, the taller the trees. And this is an area called the McGowan Creek Old Growth area just outside of Eugene, where I live, and you can pretty clearly see the old trees in comparison to an old clear cut where the trees are not very tall. So you can see, just see how scattered and fragmented some of these lands are. This is my friend Mahogany, who is standing by some old growth trees on BLM lands near Alsea Falls that he and some other forest advocates found during the first WAPR, the first management plan revision. Just wanted to go out and find where these old growth areas were so that we could alert the BLM that we wanted to protect them. So they became some of the community around Corvallis's favorite places once they discovered where these little pockets of old growth were. Unfortunately, not all of those old growth forests are protected, even today on BLM lands under the current management plan. And of course, we're here to talk about some of our fears for a revised management plan that emphasizes logging, which could end up cutting more of these trees. But currently they're not all protected. Some of them are, however. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways that BLM lands are protected. So here's a couple of my favorite places. I've already mentioned McGowan Creek. That's an amazing yew tree on the right there. And it's designated as an environmental education area. So that's a way that the BLM has recognized it as an important area, and it's unlikely to be logged. In the middle, that's a picture in the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, which probably a lot of people know about. It's one of Oregon's most recent designations as wilderness, and part of it is on BLM lands. It's connected to the Siuslaw National Forest portion to create one of the largest pieces of intact forests left in the Oregon Coast Range. And wilderness is the highest level of protection any public lands can get. And so it's safe from logging under any new plans. And then on the left, that's my friend Marina. She might be on here. Hi, Marina. Standing in Crabtree Valley. And Crabtree Valley is an area of about 1,500 acres east of Salem that has some of the oldest Douglas fir trees known in Oregon. We're talking 800 years old, some real giants. And it's designated by the BLM as both a research natural area and an area of critical environmental concern, or ACEC. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So really special place, and isn't slated to be logged under any current plans. But again, we have some fears about what might happen coming up. Wild and scenic rivers are another way that both rivers that flow through public lands and the lands surrounding them, so the forests that protect those rivers, gain some protection. So on BLM lands in Oregon, there's quite a few wild and scenic rivers. In Western Oregon, some of those include pieces of the Sandy and the Molalla, Elkhorn Creek, which is near Opal Creek, Quartzville Creek, Lobster Creek in the Coast Range. And by the way, on this map, it's the darker color of river, the sort of dark blue. Some of them blend in. And of course, the world-class Rogue River, which Francis is going to tell us more about in just a moment. If any of you have been tracking the River Democracy Act, which is a bill Oregon Wild's been pushing, it would add a lot more wild and scenic river designations to rivers and streams across Oregon, but including many on BLM lands or that flow through BLM lands. And so that includes tributaries to the Clackamas, McKenzie, and the Applegate rivers, to name just a couple, and streams that flow through really special areas like Valley of the Giants, Crabtree Valley, and past Alsea Falls. So passing that bill would also add some protections. So I mentioned ACECs, and it's one of the things that was in the very brief announcement about this new proposal. One of the things that actually is all of the ACECs designated on BLM lands were listed. So it piqued some interest. And rather than being designated by Congress, like wild and scenic rivers or wilderness, ACECs come from BLM staff identifying special places, or they can also be nominated by everyday people who find a special place and are able to basically have it included in the management plan as important for specific, relevant, and important values. So a couple of examples. This map is of the Salem District BLM. It shows all the various ACECs. So most of them are small. Most of them are not very large. Valley of the Giants is one that's, it's less than 100 acres maybe. Part of Mary's Peak is managed by the Bureau of Land Management and is designated an outstanding natural area, ACEC. But as you can see, these scattered all over the place. Many of them are special types of habitat, like meadows or bogs or wetlands. But sometimes they do include really special old growth forests, and that's why they're designated. This map is of the Eugene District BLM, and so Eugene's kind of in the middle of the map here. And a couple of places around us that I know about are Horse Rock Ridge, which is a special botanic area. And a great example here of someone who found a place special to her on BLM lands in her backyard. This is Kate. And nominated it to be protected as an ACEC under the last management plan revision. And here she stands in the Grandmother's Grove, that's what it's called, as an ACEC, just outside of Eugene in the Coast Range. And that's something that you could do too if you have a special place that's not already an ACEC. And then finally, in Southern Oregon, there's lots of great ACECs designated as well. I recently visited the Rough and Ready Creek Botanical Wayside that's managed by the BLM and is an ACEC. But there are many more all over the Southern Oregon too. And then, of course, a lot of places we know and love on BLM lands are recreation areas and maybe don't have any of these protections I've already talked about, but they're well known and they have trails. And in theory, they might not be logged, but it's going to be up to us to raise our voices around that. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the comments. Here's a couple of examples down in Southern Oregon in the Applegate Valley. The Enchanted Forest Trail is really beautiful. Wolf Creek Falls outside of Roseburg is a great BLM recreation area. And of course, Alsea Falls in the Coast Range is one of my favorites. I think I was watching salmon spawn in the picture there on the right. So some really special places. Okay, well, I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Francis, who's going to take us through why one particular region of BLM is special, and that is the Rogue River. So take it away, Francis.
Hi, thanks for having me, Chandra and Oregon Wild. So my name is Frances Oyung. I am the Rogue Riverkeeper Program Manager of the Klamath-Siskiyou Wildland Center, KS Wild, also known as. We are a nonprofit based in Ashland. So as the Rogue Riverkeeper Program Manager, I focus on water quality and aquatic habitat protection, but of course that intersects with forests, and we also have a forest watch program as well. Um,
What
we're
can I do for you?
we are we are a member of the Waterkeeper Alliance. So I just wanted to make sure that, yeah, next slide, Chandra. My phone started talking to me. I didn't even know why. The Rogue, a lot of people don't know the Rogue very well. And if you are from Northern Oregon, the Willamette Valley, a lot of people think of Southern Oregon as Roseburg, but there's a whole giant river basin south of the Umpqua, which is the Rogue. We are 3.3 million acres. It's a 215 miles long. And here's a map just to give you a little orientation. Crater Lake is in the northeast top part of the watershed. And the biggest city is Medford, and there's an arrow there. And if you've traveled up and down Interstate 5, you have gone through the Rogue Basin as you cross the state line. So we include several different counties and some big towns. Grants Pass is the other big town in the Rogue Basin. Next slide, Chandra. So I want to talk very specifically about the Medford District. So Medford District BLM is some of the most dense BLM holdings in the state of Oregon. And that has a lot to do with the history of the ONC Act, and also just how land has changed, ownership in the current sense has changed over the years. On this map, I have also put an arrow for Crater Lake in that upper right northeast quarter of the it's in that's just outside of Medford District. But you can see on this map there are two green dots indicating the BLM offices. The one on the right, the eastern one is Medford, and the one on the west is Grants Pass. And all of that yellow gold is BLM holdings. The it's 876,000 acres, 779 acres of forest, designated forest land. That's how the BLM designates it. In the upper left corner of that map, it's solid yellow, and that is the Wild and Scenic Rogue and the Rogue Wilderness, Wild Rogue Wilderness area. If you go down to the southeast corner, that's the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument down there. And let's see, next slide, Chandra. So just the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, if you don't know, it's the first national monument that was designated solely for the preservation of its unique its biodiversity, because it's an intersection of three different mountain ranges. So it was first designated by President Clinton and then expanded by President Obama. Next slide, Chandra. And then that other big holding includes the Wild and Scenic Rogue. The Wild and Scenic Rogue actually goes almost through the entire district. The different designations, including scenic or wild, are in different parts of the region. And the wilderness is within that corridor. That was also expanded in 2018 through the Dingle Act. But one of the reasons that a lot of the extraction of timber is going to happen on Medford District is because we are such a rugged and kind of remote Medford District that a lot of the big volume the old growth has not been harvested yet. So, and especially in some of these tributaries of the Rogue River, Big Windy, Kelsey Creek, Howard Creek, those tributaries that feed the wild section even are not in the tightly protected corridor, even within the expansion. So those will we have been made aware that those will be some of those areas that will be targeted by the BLM to increase volume. Next slide, Chandra. So I also wanted to just give a shout out to small streams because it is the smaller tributaries that feed the big river. So the Rogue was one of the first rivers in the United States to be designated under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. There was just the first batch in those early years. The Rogue was one of them. It was so highly valued that in that original designation of wild and scenic, the Rogue got approved to be that. But it's the small tributaries which go, if you think back on that BLM district map, they all are draining into the main stem Rogue. They have That's where the headwaters are. The groundwater is cold. The water is clean. That is where spawning happens for coho, steelhead, lamprey, chinook, and all of these tributaries are definitely going to be affected when the BLM is reducing stream buffers, which is explicitly stated in the new RMP, that they want to reduce stream buffers down to sometimes 25 feet, which for protecting stream water quality, meaning providing shade, filtering pollutants, protecting the banks from erosion. 25 feet is very little when it comes to protecting water quality. So that is where the impact will be felt the most. And as Chandra was mentioning, these are our backyards. You know, these go through all the little towns, the rural areas. They back up to rural residential. The BLM lands are, yes, our backyards in Jackson, Josephine, Curry County. Next slide. Yeah. So just, yeah, confirming protecting those tributaries is where the main stem is going to have protections. Because if the tributaries can't produce cold, clean water and provide aquatic habitat, good spawning and rearing habitat for fish, it's going to be that much more damaging to the Rogue main stem. Next slide, Chandra. So, and I just want to reiterate that drinking water and recreation are a big part of what the Rogue provides. And as I was going through photos, I realized that I had two photos to illustrate that were taken at the exact same location at different times. The photo on the left shows one of our water quality monitoring, one of our staff sampling at the drinking water intake for the city of Grants Pass. The city of Grants Pass drinks, their water source is the Rogue River. And that park where I took that photo is also a place where people launch and recreate right in town. The Grants Pass is amazingly fortunate. They have a beautiful river goes right through their city. So yeah, next slide, Chandra. So I just want to also reiterate that the BLM is known for trying to circumvent environmental rules, which is why organizations like KS Wild, Oregon Wild, and others have been suing the BLM because of their violation of existing laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act. So this is an example. This photo is harvest done as a part of salvage and hazard tree removal after the Rum Creek fire in the wild and scenic corridor of the Rogue River. And even though there was old growth trees way, way out at the edge of, at the end of a dead end spur road, they were finding volume and using the rationale of salvaging hazard trees to pull these out when in if they were in compliance, they would not be harvesting within the view shed of the wild and scenic river. So anyways, these are the kind of things that we are expecting might be happening under the new RMP. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Francis. It's always good to get rooted into one place and see all the things, all the reasons it's important. All right, just a reminder, if folks have questions, there's some great questions coming in, but if you have more, go ahead and use the Q&A, and I'm kind of sorting those as they come in to see what we can do after the presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to John Persell, Oregon Wild staff attorney, to talk about some of the legal stuff and might answer some of the questions we have in the in the Q&A as well. Tell us what's going on, John.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm John Persell, staff attorney with Oregon Wild. Apologize up front. I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so if I sound a bit hoarse or cough, yeah, my apologies. I want to just review a little bit what Chandra and Francis have already shared as we dive more into the statutory and legal context of this proposal from BLM. As Chandra noted, BLM manages these 2.5 million acres in Western Oregon, and most of those acres were revested lands originally granted to railroad companies, and they now exist in what's known as a checkerboard pattern. And most of these acres are managed under two statutes, the ONC Act of 1937 and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976. And next slide. So we've got these two statutes that apply to these lands. The ONC Act of 1937 directs BLM to manage classified timberlands for permanent forest production, as well as watershed protection, stream flow regulation, economic stability, and recreation. And then in 1976, Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, what we call FLPMA. And FLPMA has a multiple use mandate, and it lists out all the different uses that BLM could put our public lands to. But there is some case law that says BLM does not have to put the lands to all those feasible uses or to any one particular use. But FLPMA also required BLM to develop management plans with public involvement for the lands that it oversees. And it also requires that site-specific projects conform to those management plans that are developed. So that sort of sets the stage for why we're talking about management plans for these Western Oregon BLM lands. So again, with the 1937 ONC Act, this act, it's almost 90 years old, so pushing 100. But it's built around this principle of sustained yield. And that was geared towards a permanent source of timber supply, watersheds, stream flow, economic stability, and recreational facilities. So all of that wrapped into a principle of sustained yield. And next slide. But there's also this provision in the ONC Act that directs BLM to give 50% of timber revenue to the respective counties in which the ONC lands are found and where the logging occurs. And there's 18 of these counties in the state of Oregon that get this revenue sharing system. And just recently, though, the One Big Beautiful bill increased this to 75%. So 75% of the revenue from logging sales on these ONC lands would go to the counties. So there's this incentive for the counties to advocate for increased logging on these lands at the expense of other values, unfortunately. And when the Northwest Forest Plan came into effect in the mid 1990s, that dramatically decreased logging in order to ensure protection for species listed under the Endangered Species Act and their habitat. But that inevitably decreased funding to the counties from those logging sales because there were fewer logging sales happening. So in 2001, Congress created the Secure Rural Schools and Self-Determination Act, and that sort of severed the tie between logging volume and payments to counties. Counties had to either choose between the logging sale revenue or these other types of payments. And it was meant to encourage and incentivize counties to find alternative revenue sources. But what we do know is that logging at the levels to fund counties at the historic levels they were funded before the Northwest Forest Land, that simply is not sustainable and would have really adverse impacts to multiple values, including our clean water supplies, our wildlife habitat, landslide risks, and so many other things. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, these counties, the ONC counties, they have sort of coordinated amongst themselves, and they often align with timber industry lobbyists on lawsuits related to the management of these BLM lands in Western Oregon. And the counties, are upset about the reduced revenue, but they have not taken steps to modernize their own tax rates, property tax rates, but continue to rely primarily on federal payments, either through the Secure Rural Schools Act or the logging sale revenue. We can go to the next slide. So let's kind of place ourselves where we are right now, how we got here. So I mentioned that the Northwest Forest Plan took effect in the mid 1990s, and that originally applied to both the national forests and BLM lands within the range of the spotted owl. But then starting with the Bush II administration, so around 2004, 2005, that administration wanted to update the management plans for Western Oregon BLM lands to remove them from the Northwest Forest Plan structure. There was a series of litigation among conservation organizations that defeated those attempts to remove the BLM lands from the Northwest Forest Plan. And we referred to some of those efforts as WOPR, the Western Oregon Plan revisions. But then ultimately, the Obama administration in 2016 did successfully implement what we call WOPR Junior, the 2016 resource management plans. And those are still in effect today. And those plans, WOPR Junior, did withdraw Western Oregon BLM lands from the Northwest Forest Plan, and they rolled back riparian buffers to more narrow buffers. And while they continued the general concept of what we call late successional reserves or old growth reserves, they weakened the logging restrictions within them. That plan, the WOPR Junior, also allocated certain lands to what's known as the harvest land base. And that is what BLM pointed to as the permanent source of timber supply under the ONC Act. And one other point about the 2016 plans, there's some nominal protection in there for trees that were established by 1850 and over 40 inches in diameter. And that is the main mechanism in those plans to protect old growth trees. But of course, that comes with a lot of loopholes. So interestingly enough, conservation groups challenged the 2016 plans, and BLM prevailed in those challenges. But not only the conservation groups challenged those plans, the timber industry also challenged those plans. And the timber industry brought a whole separate lawsuit and argued that the allocation of lands to old growth reserves and riparian reserves violated the ONC Act's mandate for permanent forest production. And ultimately, this wound its way through courts in DC, and the appellate court in DC ultimately ruled that the plans did not violate the ONC Act, but that the ONC Act provides BLM multiple layers of discretion on how land should be classified, how to balance the Act's multiple objectives, and how to carry out the mandate that timberlands be managed for permanent forest production. So the appellate court found that BLM has a lot of discretion in how to carry out the ONC Act. And that court characterized reserves as an exercise of discretion that reclassified certain lands as non-timberlands, and noted that riparian reserves and old growth reserves were important to advance protections under the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act, and that they help stabilize ONC land's overall timber production capacity. So we had this challenge from the timber industry. They were unsuccessful in getting a rollback of the reserve system, but that sort of sets the stage for what's proposed now. And you can go to the next slide. So now we have this proposal to roll back protections for these lands even further. According to the notice that was published in the Federal Register, 2 million acres, or 77% of these Western Oregon BLM lands, could be opened to aggressive logging, including clearcutting, with no indication that there would be protections for old growth trees or stands within those areas. The notice specifically calls for a return to maximum logging that aligns with historically higher levels. And what that points to is before spotted owls were listed, before coho salmon were listed under the Endangered Species Act, talking about, the historically higher levels from the 60s through the 80s when clearcutting was happening at a rapid pace. So we are pretty sure that this proposal will eliminate late successional reserves, and the notice very specifically said it would reduce riparian protections down to as minimal as 25-foot buffers, which, as Francis indicated, offer basically no protection for stream quality. It also indicated that all currently designated areas of critical environmental concern would be reevaluated. So that's another point to keep in mind, that we're going to have to defend the places that were already pointed to as warranting greater protection under the 2016 plans. One of the things that stood out to me in the notice as well was that BLM was pointing to wildfire risk reduction as a justification for what it was proposing. And that stands in really stark contrast to what the science says about aggressive logging practices like clearcutting, and what BLM itself says in its own environmental analyses. Time after time in its environmental analyses, BLM acknowledges that clearcutting and similar forms of logging actually increase fire hazards for up to 50 years. So there's a real disconnect there between the notion that we need to return to maximum logging and that will somehow reduce wildfire risk. And overall, we just noticed there was no grounding in science in the notice, or any consideration for the needs of imperiled plants, fish, and wildlife, or the communities that rely on these lands for clean water and recreation. Next slide. So Chandra is going to share a bit more about where we're at with the comment period, but it runs until March 23rd. There's some concern that we won't get a full comment period on a draft environmental impact statement down the road, although currently the Department of Interior's regulations require one. But we've seen this administration aggressively try to roll back those public involvement regulations as well. So we're going to keep an eye on that. We feel pretty confident that the timber industry has this administration's ear and is driving the bus on this proposal in response to, its major litigation loss in that case where they challenged the use of reserves on the ONC lands, and in response to some of the litigation wins that Oregon Wild and KS Wild and Cascadia Wildlands and other groups have had in the past few years, holding the BLM accountable to even the protections within the 2016 plans that are in place right now. But another point that we're going to be watching closely is a year ago, the Trump administration issued an executive order calling for ramped up timber production on public lands. And it specifically mentioned the use of what's known as the God Squad to skirt Endangered Species Act issues. This is a committee made up of cabinet members that essentially can vote on whether to proceed with an action that would otherwise jeopardize Endangered Species Act listed species. And it's only rarely ever been invoked, but we're going to be watching carefully to see if that's what this administration has in mind with this proposal. On almost the same day as BLM published this notice in the Federal Register that it wants to revise these plans and roll back protections, Representative Cliff Bentz, who represents eastern and parts of southern Oregon, introduced a bill that he calls the ONC Renewal Act. And if you go to the next slide, it's conspicuously timed with this notice that BLM published. And what this bill would do would be to establish timber production as the primary purpose of ONC lands. And so all those other purposes, such as stream flow regulation and recreation, would become secondary. And it would limit sustained yield, the sustained yield principle, just to revenue generation for counties, not for those other purposes. And it would further restrict BLM's discretion on classifying timberlands. It would define timberlands as any lands capable of bearing growth of 300,000 board feet of timber on each 40-acre section. So BLM would no longer have as much discretion not to classify lands as timberlands. And then it would also require that these management plans be revised within 2 years of enactment of the bill. So that's something that we're going to keep an eye on. We don't necessarily know that it's going to get much traction in Congress, but clearly something that we should also be aware of. Next slide. So I wanted to share just a little bit about some current litigation that groups like Oregon Wild and KS Wild, Cascadia Wildlands, and others have been engaged in against the BLM. I mentioned those 2016 resource management plans that are currently in place. They do have some legal hooks in there, even though there's, some relatively loose language and loopholes. We have been successful at holding BLM accountable to some of those legal hooks. And so that is another concern for us. If these plans are weakened, we would not have as many sideboards or hooks to hold BLM accountable to going forward. So for example, on what we call the IVM or Late Mungers logging project, IVM stands for Integrated Vegetation Management, and this basically encompasses almost all of the Medford district. KS Wild, Cascadia Wildlands, Oregon Wild, and Applegate-Siskiyou Alliance all filed suit. The conservation groups prevailed on the merits, and so there's still some litigation underway on what the appropriate remedy should be to set aside the logging decisions that have already been made. But in that particular case, we brought a claim under the resource management plan that BLM failed to demonstrate that the logging that it authorized in spotted owl habitat would not delay development of that habitat into the most highly valuable nesting roosting habitat by more than 20 years compared to no logging. So it's a kind of a wonky standard that we've been able to hold BLM accountable to, that it has to show that its logging proposals are not going to delay development of the most needed spotted owl habitat. And then we have another legal case currently pending called Blue and Gold, and this is in the Roseburg district. And Cascadia Wildlands and Oregon Wild and Umpqua Watersheds have brought suit. And there we're using a claim under the resource management plan that BLM failed to ensure protection of those 40-inch diameter established by 1850 trees, the old growth trees. BLM is targeting some of the oldest stands in this area for pretty aggressive logging without ensuring that none of those big old trees are going to be cut. And then another case on the Medford district challenges the Last Chance project. And we actually have a hearing in Eugene on March 17th. In this case, KS Wild, Oregon Wild, and Cascadia Wildlands are the plaintiffs here. And another RMP claim, or resource management plan claim, that BLM failed to adhere to its own Bureau sensitive species direction, in particular for the northwestern pond turtle. And that direction requires that BLM implement protective mitigation measures. And right now, those pond turtles are hibernating underground upland from the streams, and where they've authorized logging is going to be right over that overwintering habitat. And one last one that we recently filed just in January, the 42 Divide Project on the Roseburg District. Here, Cascadia Wildlands, Oregon Wild, and Umpqua Watersheds are the plaintiffs. And we've claimed that BLM failed to, again, protect older structurally complex forest stands in late successional reserves, and also failed to demonstrate that it would meet that 20-year standard, not delaying spotted owl habitat development by 20 years or more compared to no logging. So those are some of the pieces of litigation that are underway under the current plans. And so we want to make sure that any future plans have strong sideboards so that we can continue to hold BLM accountable to protect the most valuable habitat.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Yeah, that was great. So folks, I know we're probably going to go a little long. I would like to get to a number of questions after I wrap up with what are we going to do about all this? But if you need to leave, I totally understand. And just keep in mind that we are recording, and that this recording will be available tomorrow or the next day so that you can watch the Q&A. All right, so yeah, we've got a lot of work to do. Thanks to John for being involved in all that litigation. The thing is that even though there's a lot going on, we are stepping up, and it's not just the organizations, but we have seen a tremendous response to this particular proposal and threat. And so it's really promising to know that people really care about these BLM forests. And yeah, speaking of lots of things going on, I just wanted to point out that, and John mentioned this too, this particular proposal for BLM lands is just one front in the war on public lands being waged by this administration. We've seen so many rollbacks and, removals of protections, flat off lands, public land sales, and these executive orders mandating more mining and logging. So this proposal clearly comes in the context of all of that. But there, again, these are really important for us. People really care about them, and there are ways that we can fight back. So a lot of the questions that people had actually is about how to comment, but then what else? Because isn't the BLM just going to ignore our comments? So I hope to address that here. We do need to speak for the trees. There's my Lorax friend. And getting on the record with the BLM is one part of that. So it is important to submit comments during this open comment period that ends March 23rd. We've tried to make it easy for you to do that through an action page, which maybe you've already taken action through alerts that Oregon Wild has sent you, but you can go use this QR code, and also this will be sent out later. To do that, if you want to do it directly through BLM's website, you can do that with the QR code on the lower half of the screen. And yeah, I understand that it can be a little daunting to submit public comments, or you don't really know what to say. We have tried to make that easy again with some talking points. But I think one of the most important things to remember is that, it's not just an anonymous critter speaking up for the trees. It's you. You have your personal experience. So here's me with this amazing tree on BLM. And I can talk about in my comments why being amongst old growth trees is so valuable to me, and what I saw there, and name the specific place, and why I want to see these trees protected, et cetera, et cetera. So it is important to do that. You can talk about whether you get your drinking water from BLM forests, or you go hiking there with your family, or any of those sorts of things. And you should voice your concerns about the impacts of increased logging on water quality, on wildlife habitat, on carbon storage, on wildfire risk, a lot of these things that we've been talking about here tonight. And you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to, have references in your comments. It's okay to not have all of that stuff. Many organizations with smart lawyers like John are going to be submitting technical comments on this plan, and they're going to be covering all of that. So from your, the general public's perspective, you really just need to be speaking up and making sure that the BLM understands that these are important. And if you can raise, specific issues and back it up, that's great. But it is going to be done by a lot of other people too. I will just say to this point that you don't have to be an expert. I visited with some second graders today, and they wrote letters to the BLM. They wrote letters and pictures that they are sending in to express why they want to see old growth protected. And will the BLM, put that on the record? I mean, they have to. It's part of the public process. Will they, decide to protect these trees because of these kids? Man, I hope so. But if not, we have other ways of making an impact. So I'm just also going to direct you to a couple other steps. We talked a little bit about areas of critical environmental concern and how they can be nominated by the public. If anybody's interested in doing that, it's a little bit of a process. You need to have some resources, lined up, some maps and information. Contact me. My email is cl@oregonwild.org, and I'm going to be helping some other people do that. You can turn your comment into a letter to the editor, to your local newspaper, online media, blog, whatever you do. We have an activist toolkit that helps people find, those papers and email addresses, and sort of some hot tips on how to write letters. And so you can elevate this in the public eye by participating with the local media or social media. And then another really important action as a backstop to this plan is to let our legislators know that these areas are important, that Cliff Bence's bill that mandates timber production, as the primary focus for these BLM lands is not what we want to see. And so our senators, our representatives need to hear that from you. And so Oregon Wild set up an action directly to our congressional delegation. Got it here on this QR code on the left. And so you can write to them. You can use the same talking points, talk about why these BLM lands are important, but specifically we've got tons and tons of good questions. Definitely can't get to them all, but I have some good ones lined up. So I'm going to, and I will try to look at recent ones here too, but I have lined up a bunch. And John and Francis, if you want to come on and Actually, I'll put back up one of those last slides so that people can reference that. Okay, and we'll just try to take about 5 minutes because I know we were already over, but somebody asked about the timeline for this being implemented and whether litigation would be able to stop this proposal until the next administration. I don't know if you want to answer that, John.
Well, we're certainly engaging and talking with our partners about how to make the most of this comment period, and keeping an eye out for what happens next in terms of a draft environmental impact statement. There's a number of steps that are still going to have to happen. We know that this administration is trying to move really quickly with this and other attempts to weaken protections for our public lands. So we do think that they are trying to move quickly on a time frame within this current administration. Remains to be seen yet, what litigation might ultimately occur. That really depends on what we see and how they are adhering to both the procedural and substantive aspects of all the applicable laws. So I don't want to get ahead of myself and say, for sure this is what litigation is going to occur, but it's going to be heavily scrutinized by organizations like Oregon Wild, KS Wild, and others to make sure that we use all the tools in our toolbox, to protect these lands.
Yeah, great. Francis, somebody asked specifically about how you knew that the Medford District forests were going to be targeted under this plan.
Personal communication.
Okay. Nothing official, but
No, I mean, we have people who communicate with us who know information.
great.
I mean,
Yeah, I wasn't trying to reveal your sources, but someone was like,
I mean, it's the scale at which they are planning this amount of volume. It'll be all the BLM districts, but certainly Medford, because we do have a lot of volume compared to a lot of the other Medford, the other Western Oregon districts.
yeah, thank you.
So they have to get that volume somewhere. A lot of it will be from Medford.
Right. A couple questions about ACEC's both access and other ways of finding out whether special areas that people know are threatened. So I think I can answer one of these questions, which is about whether ACECs are usually closed to the public, because someone saw that the Valley of the Giants, for example, says public access closed. And I can say generally, no, they're not closed to the public, though some are harder to access than others. Valley of the Giants is closed the road is closed. There was a big landslide last year on the road that leads there, and so that's why it's closed. The area itself, if you could get there, is technically open. But then how do you find out if logging is planned in some of these special areas? And I think that's a really good question. And Francis, maybe you have some insight too. But the BLM basically posts things on their website. So you have to track that. And that's why honestly it's good to be plugged into one of these organizations like Oregon Wild or KS Wild, because we do that for you. That said, we don't always send out, email alerts about every project that's being proposed. There's a lot of those going on. And so just being connected to organizations and reaching out to staff is one way of doing it, or following BLM websites, unfortunately.
It will take a while for all of this to come to pass. It's not going to happen tomorrow or even in 6 months. But staying attuned to your local place-based advocates, we will keep you informed.
Great. And then this is maybe a little outside of the scope, but I think it's kind of a fun question to think about. We can think about it legally or just philosophically. Someone has heard about wild areas and rivers and other countries being protected by becoming recognized as a living organism. And is that a realistic approach to take for lands in Oregon? And why or why not? I know, really, really deep, right? But it's just, as we think about how special these places are there ways of getting creative in that realm?
Yeah, I think it would take, a real grassroots effort to get probably some legislation in place that, you know, would recognize those kind of rights of places. I haven't seen that happen in Oregon yet. I'm aware that it's been happening in some other countries. Our current legal system isn't really set up in a way that is particularly accommodating to that type of recognition of rights of a place, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen if there was, a groundswell of support for it. Um, you know, there would be a number of steps that would have to go through, and I'm sure it would be challenged by the powers that be in court ultimately. But that's something to, you know, think about as a long term strategy.
Well, I think we might leave it there. There were a lot of other great questions. Hopefully, we answered some of them. Thanks to everyone who's still here listening in. And thank you to John and to Francis for sharing your knowledge and passion about these places. Thanks to all of you out there who are going to write comments and contact your legislators about these really important BLM lands. So, good night, and thanks, everyone.